All right. Happy Sunday night, y'all. It's good to see you. Wes Seiler here for Refounding Fathers. I love hosting this show, and it's always fun when we have a full cast on, which is what we've got tonight. So we've got Chris, my liberal buddy. Happy birthday, man, and welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. I had a great birthday. I got to see the beauty and wonder of California, this great state that was so offensively besmirched last week on the show. But I don't take any personal offense to that because I understand that bashing California is just a thing that Southerners have to do in lieu of developing a personality. So it is.
We got tons of see
Hey,
it.
first off, we also like our guns here. So that's my other personality. It's bashing California. Actually, more New York in my state, but that and guns. That is basically you nailed it. Yeah, you're not wrong.
The first time I was in California, I was flown out there to Santa Barbara, where I think you were, which I mean, it really is. It's a beautiful spot. But I was there to see Ronald Reagan's ranch and his whole like history and heritage center, and to learn all about him. I think like Mitt Romney was out there when I was, and I met him. And yeah, it was a great time, except for like the $40 that I paid for like a 5 minute cab ride, and then like just in general how expensive everything was, which I'm told is very common. So that's part of California's personality. So you can have all that part of it, like you can have it. But it was beautiful. I enjoyed being out there. So I'm glad you had a good time. And then Kyle and your firearm there. Welcome to the show.
Yeah,
Always good to have Kyle, your libertarian buddy, on here. I know this is a topic you've been waiting for a while. What we're going to get into tonight. So I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Wes. Glad to be here, definitely. And Chris, in your absence, it was okay. I feel like I read Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Twitter, so I felt like I was ready to defend the liberal position. Never came to that, but I felt like I was ready.
Good to know.
All right. And then Megan. So, I love having Megan on the show for several reasons. The main one, though, I mean, you're very good at what you do. We love having your perspective on here, especially because it's conservative, which allows me to be the host on this. I get to take a seat back and just kind of watch you work. So thank you for being on the show, representing the conservative perspective and hanging with these guys and keeping them honest. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me back again. Always a pleasure.
So one of the things that we haven't done in a couple weeks that I love doing is taking a minute to look at what's going on in media and Hollywood, all that, California culture that Chris, enjoys, I'm sure, but getting a chance to look at like what is going on in the media world, and then how do we each filter that through our different perspectives. And there's a lot of things that we could talk about. There's so many movies that are starting to come out. People are starting to go back to theaters a little bit, at least talking about, doing that in most states. But then there's also the cultural aspect of Hollywood, and how, one, pop singer or movie star or whatever can go immediately to the top of the news cycle and get everybody who's politically minded to focus on them. And that's the case with one Demi Lovato who came out this week. And I posted this on our page. I know there's been some pretty good discussion on this. But, Chris, you're going to have to help me with it. Kind of what I said in the post is trying to understand this, because I have plenty of friends who are gay. I know several people who are transsexual, but this one is kind of new for me, trying to understand where Demi Lovato is at. And I keep using Demi's name because I don't really understand how all of this works, because apparently we're supposed to refer to Demi now, not as he or she or as someone, but instead non-binary they. And everybody like is going along with it in like CNN and MSNBC and any story. I mean, you see this as a CNN story, and it's they now. And we had a private discussion about this for a few minutes, I think, this week, and then of course, playing out on Facebook. I'm just fascinated at everybody's take on how this works in our culture. I tend to be more reluctant to even focus on someone going through, a change in their personality. But when Demi's putting it this public, like, it's everywhere. And then of course CNN and everything is blasting it out. Now we're kind of forced to talk about it. And Demi's not exactly like a, B or C level singer. I mean, this person has been at the top of many charts and things like that. So we kind of have to talk about it. So Chris, help me I I pick on you for this. Well, one, because you weren't here last week, and so I just enjoy doing it, and I miss you. But two, because I think on the liberal side is where the most defense of this is going to be. So, am I wrong if I say she at this point, and why?
Well, I have to start by saying I had not actually heard about this until I saw it on your page.
Yeah.
And, I've seen this, charge that this is just a bid for attention. I personally had not seen this story, and I'm someone who's like pretty active on Twitter, pretty engaged in like pop culture news. I am not non-binary, so I am not necessarily the best person to ask about this subject or this perspective. I do know a few non-binary people, and it is an adjustment. I don't really have a whole lot of trouble adjusting to the pronoun they, just because like I use the singular they a lot to refer to people. Usually it's, used in like a hypothetical situation, like when you're referring to someone whose gender you don't know. And instead of saying like he or she, it's simpler to just say they. So to me, that is not much of an adjustment. I do struggle a lot with like the neo pronouns, which I don't know if you're aware of what those are, but things like, I don't even know how it's pronounced, like zer or like zim. And I struggle to reconcile those with kind of my worldview and my like cultural knowledge, because I'm just not familiar with many people who go by that. And that could be my own ignorance. That could just be me not having experience with those people. But like every cultural change, I think the more experience that you have with diverse people and people who feel like they are outside of the norm of what society kind of expects, I think the more comfortable you become. And yeah, you mess up. Yes, I've misgendered people. But generally speaking, if you come at it from a place of understanding and not dismissiveness, I find that it doesn't become that big of a deal. So I don't know. It doesn't, like everything Demi Lovato does, it doesn't have any effect on my life. But I don't have any problem with it. I've had students who are non-binary. They have tended to use more traditional pronouns, but it's just, this is the new cultural change. And I think it's, as long as it's not causing harm to anyone else, I don't see the problem with just paying them the respect they ask for.
Well, you kind of hit there on the end of why it matters, right? Is it's not just Demi's life or whatever. I mean, legally, I don't think anybody would say, oh, this is horrible what she's doing from a legal standpoint. Like, you can call yourself whatever you want. I mean, people have done, especially like in Hollywood, people do all kinds of weird stuff. But it's the cultural change, is that there are young men and young women who are looking up to Demi and saying, oh, okay, well, Demi can do this, so therefore my teacher has to respect me doing this. And so does all my classmates. And if anybody does not, I mean, we see this all the time in corporate America, and military, and things like that, is you start to hit a point where it goes from, okay, this type of thing is just to each their own, to a point of it's generally accepted, to a point of it's enforced, and then all of a sudden to a point of, oh, you're not willing to call them what they want. Now you're the enemy, right? And I guess that's the concern here, especially with this, because I'm kind of a linguist. Like, that was my foreign languages were my major in college, and I just, that singular versus plural aspect of this is just so bizarre. If you're talking about a person who isn't sure where they stand on the spectrum of he versus she, like, okay, I get it. Again, I know people that are transgender, but when you start getting into the singular versus plural, and maybe it's just the lack of options in English, it just seems like we're in a weird spot. So, Kyle, maybe actually wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah. I have a couple of different thoughts there, and I'll first, I guess, address the linguist side, is what you said. Actually, France, this past week, there was a story coming out of France that the Ministry of Education there, they were trying to force some of these, non-binary pronouns, and of course, in most Romance languages, French being one of them, there are masculine and feminine pronouns, and so there was a whole list of non-binary pronouns and ways that you're supposed to alter the French language and things like that. And the Ministry of Education in France just outrightly rejected it. Says it messes up our language too much. It's right. Just, we can't do this. So kind of an interesting story there, kind of dealing from it from a linguistic perspective. For me personally, so, being a libertarian, I have what I kind of think, and then I also have what I believe on a private level. And honestly, if she wants to be a non-binary person, that more power to her. That's fine if that's who she feels like she or whatever the pronoun they want to be. That's fine. The issue for me, but both of you have already said, is when that issue becomes compelled speech. We actually talked about Jordan Peterson a couple of weeks ago. This is the issue that brought him to prominence, was Canada's compelled speech laws when it came to non-binary and transgender people. That the government there was saying you have to, by force of law, call these people by whatever pronouns they want to be called by. And Jordan Peterson, who has said many times publicly, goes, I will call a student whatever they want to be called, but the government's not going to force me to do it, right? That's where the issue comes in. So it's kind of interesting. We see the kind of culmination of a lot of these different things. And, as someone who loves free speech, Western society is built primarily on the idea of free speech and the exchange of free ideas. Government can't coerce thought or opinion, things like that. So this is a really, really important issue. And I think we should be willing to accept it and tolerate it until it becomes, enforceable by law.
What do you think, Megan?
Well, I think it's a little bit silly because of, the plural singular thing. I think that is a little bit odd. And, like Chris said, we do have these other pronouns that start with X, if we're going to do that, then why not just make up a new word instead of using they? But also, like Kyle said, you call somebody what they want to be called. That's not really a big deal either. So this, to me, this comes back to the media again, because why does anybody care? Honestly, why do we care that Demi Lovato suddenly is a they? But I gotta say, she's always looked very feminine. So, where has the boyish? It kind of seems like she is looking for attention in this particular instance. There's a lot going on here,
Sure.
Yeah. The media, but if we want to be non-binary, then why does the media? They're so quick to judge us conservatives,
right?
But you want to be non-binary? Something's wrong here. If that makes any sense.
I put the comment there from Kendall saying that, she's just craving attention in the best way she can think of, right? So there was definitely people who thought that on her feed, and they're thinking it's not legitimate. To me, ultimately, I would say that's not something that we can really determine, right? Like what's really going on in her head. Is she honest or not? That's really, time will tell, I guess, on that, but it's really hard to determine. I simply think of it as the influence that culture has on us. The whole point we calling this a media moment is people are paying attention. And maybe not you and I, Megan, or Kyle and Chris, because we're adults and we've made decisions and things like that. But, if you're 12 or 13 years old, you're still trying to figure out what life is like, and then you see someone that's your idol making these choices and you think, hey, maybe I need. I remember when I was a kid, Eminem, was everywhere, right? Like he was making his movie and everything else. And so there was all these people who were done, bleaching their hair, right? Because he did, right? And so I can only imagine being an educator. Go ahead, Chris.
I see this charge a lot that like celebrities, by talking about any kind of personal struggle, are just trying to get attention for themselves, which may be true. But at the same time, they're bringing attention to an issue that millions of people may be going through. Most non-binary people are not famous. And there are 12 and 13-year-old non-binary people out there who feel like they don't fit into the labels of man or woman or boy or girl. And, maybe they're young and they're still figuring things out. But maybe someone like Demi Lovato coming out as non-binary will help them on their journey of self-discovery. Maybe it can bring attention in a positive way to an issue that millions of people go through. I see the same charge leveled at Meghan and Harry for talking about, abuse and depression and things like that. And it's like, yes, that does bring attention to them, but it also brings attention to an issue that millions of people go through, most of whom are not famous and maybe can benefit from seeing that there are people like them out there.
Right. Yeah. I think, in positive or negative, I think really is case by case basis. Because, everybody, I think, goes through at some point some level of self-doubt, right? Like, it's just part of life. And especially when you're growing up, right? Is this the answer for the majority of them? I don't know. Like, probably not, right? You think, well, hey, I feel ostracized at school, but maybe it has nothing to do with how I treat people. Maybe it's this, right? Like, it worked for
right.
Demi. Like, let me try it for myself. So I think you could also
That's
miss
right.
it just as easy as leads. So anyway, more on that. But I love the fact that it gave us a chance to talk about something that, like you said, Chris, can affect a much wider scope than just Hollywood, and yet kind of Hollywood's forcing us to talk about it. So that's a lot of fun to be able to introduce that, and I'm sure we'll have more. Our main topic for tonight, though, is we have been talking about guns and immigration, right? That's kind of been our theme for the month. And we got into immigration a lot. We had a lot of good debates there, a lot of really interesting takes that y'all had. But we haven't really talked about guns much. And so for the next couple episodes, I think it'll be fun to really get a focus on the Second Amendment and how we see it, starting there, and then maybe getting into more of the practicals of daily life and all that, and the many guns that Kyle has clearly like in his room, and seeing how that applies to us. When you look at the Second Amendment, everybody loves the part in red there, right? Like, shall not be infringed. I think it's important to see it in context, and there's a lot of like discussion in conservative circles about this. You would think that it's all completely like, hey, we get to have as many firearms as possible. We get to do whatever we want with them, and there's no restrictions. And there's certainly that part of conservatism, but there's other thinkers, and there's other writers and leaders within the conservative movement who draw attention to the rest of the actual statement there, the context in which it was produced. And that's kind of what I want to talk about here is the well-regulated militia was necessary at the time to be able to defend the colonies from the British, from other invaders that they were worried about. And they saw it as a fixture in their society and really a leader. And, they were trying to build up the Continental Army, and they needed the militia to be able to help them. And so they thought that was necessary for the security of a free state. You see that written right there. And it's tied to the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And so I just think that condition is sometimes overlooked as we talk about the Second Amendment. So let me know what you guys think of that first. I've got a couple other slides on this that we can get into. But I'm curious, and kind of start with Megan here, because the Second Amendment is so important to conservatives. How do you view the Second Amendment? Are you one of those people that thinks of it as there is no restrictions whatsoever, or do you think it actually should be conditionalized and tied to the security of a free state?
That's a good question. And Kyle brought this up before, is that, what are the distinctions between types of firearms? What's a semi-automatic weapon as opposed to something else? And I really like the notion that every citizen is supposed to be a part-time, what do they call it? Part-time soldier. That's not the right word, but
a militia member. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Whoops. That makes a lot of sense to me. That then there's this definite separation of, not having our own army because we don't want that army to overtake us either.
Right.
To be honest, I live by myself, so I have a gun, and if somebody were to come and try and take that, well, then I shouldn't be living here, So
there's probably a 10 or 12 pound possum that found that out at my house like a couple of years ago. That's the only time I've ever actually
a big possum, dude.
outside of like going to a gun range and stuff like that. Like, it was terrorizing my dog, and he had chased it up onto a fence, and I blasted it in the face and then had to bury it. Like, that was pretty much the extent of me using a firearm around here. Like, but immediately when you say that, like, I think that's interesting, Megan, because now we're talking about firearms to protect our property, which I think is how most Americans see it, especially conservatives, is it's about protecting, my domain and stuff, which, maybe that's tied to what they're saying here, but, I'm not entirely sure, because they were talking about the security of the state. And I guess that, to me, on the conservative debate within, our circles about the Second Amendment, is they're talking about not the security of individuals, but they're talking about the security of a free state in general.
That's right.
So I don't know. I find that fascinating. What's your take on it, Kyle? Because I know libertarians very big on the Second Amendment as well.
Yeah, it's probably the issue that I am probably the most versed on and the most passionate about, if I'm being honest with you, that and free speech.
Yeah.
All right, so a well-regulated militia. Let's kind of break down some of those words, right? Well-regulated. Regulated does not mean a tightly controlled group, right? Regulated at the time that the Constitution was written meant provisioned, a well-provisioned, a well-supplied, a well-armed militia being necessary to secure the free state. So going back to what you asked Megan, what is a militia? Well, it was pretty clear among the founding fathers that the militia referred to the people in general, the people at large. George Mason, for example, has a very simple quote, says, "I ask, sir, what is the militia? It is the whole people, except for a few public officials." And that's the general thought of the vast majority of founding fathers, not just on the national level, but also looking into the states that ratified the Constitution, that the militia is simply the people. Yeah. So a well-armed populace is essentially what it's saying is necessary to the security of a free state. And I definitely believe that is a true thing. We can look through the history of gun control here in the 20th century, and nearly every country that was had their rights taken away in terms of firearms was either slaughtered by their own government or faced extermination by another external threat. So, it happened in England, so even, think about a country like England that has been disarmed by its government. Obviously, they were not put in jail by their government. However, when the Nazis were tearing across Europe, they actually had advertisements in America saying, "Send our citizens guns so we can defend ourselves." And so it's kind of an interesting advertisement. I'd be happy to share that with people. It's a pretty cool piece of history there. So, a well-armed populace is absolutely essential, not only for the threat of an external government coming in, but also from a standing army from your own government as well.
But what do you think, Chris? So, I mean, obviously on the liberal take, for a lot of liberals is very different than this. How do you see the Second Amendment? Do you agree, that it's necessary, that the people at large keep and bear arms, or is that like outdated in your mind?
Well, first of all, I really like your brother Jonathan's suggestion there of forget the gun, try the samurai sword. Gives you all the benefits of self-defense without the risks of mass casualties. But in all seriousness, I think it's a really badly worded amendment. To put my grammar nerd, teacher perspective back to use after, coming out in defense of the singular they. We've got the passive voice. We've got an indirect clause joined to a direct clause with a semicolon. It's just a mess. I do think that the Heller decision in 2008 correctly defined the Second Amendment as providing for the right of individuals to bear arms. And that is a hot take on the left. Many liberals do not see it that way. I would add that even the most conservative judge on the court, and one of the most conservative judges in living memory, Antonin Scalia, did not necessarily think that meant that the Second Amendment was unlimited. So I do think there can be reasonable restrictions. But, as someone with a deep distrust of government, I think that if the government wants to restrict something, they need to make a very powerful case for that thing to be restricted. And often in the wake of these horrible and tragic mass shootings, we see a lot of gun control proposals coming out, and some of them I think are useful, and some of them often have no real connection to the crime that occurred, and no really plausible sense of this will actually cut down on this kind of problem. So I'm a moderate on the issue. It does, I grew up kind of adjacent to guns. My dad is a big gun guy. I didn't retain as much, knowledge or proficiency with guns as I'm sure he would have liked. But it does sadden me that there's so much of a political divide on this issue, when if you look at the polling, there are a lot of solutions that most Americans agree on. I was reading a study earlier that said about 88% of gun owners favor universal background checks, including on private sellers, which would close the, as Kyle has pointed out, the inaccurately named gun show loophole. But when you get into ideas like Megan brought up of banning specific guns, banning assault weapons, that becomes a lot more controversial. So I do think there is a middle ground on this issue. I think both sides tend to go with extremes, and that includes some of Biden's proposals that are not healthy or conducive to solving this debate.
Well, that's what we'll get
No,
into.
there was. Sorry, yeah. Let me just interject one thing there. At the time the Constitution was written and ratified, there was no weapon that was off limits for the people to own. The citizens had private cannons. They had private warships. Even there's a famous letter, I believe it was from Madison, or it might have been Monroe, who authorized, because there was a question about, someone wrote the president a letter saying, "Hey, can I have this private warship?" And the president said, "Of course you can. Why can't you?" And so, the warship was, obviously, it was the most lethal weapon of its time, right? It was the tank, it was the bomber, it was the most powerful weapon on the face of the earth, and private citizens were allowed to have it. Not only that, we saw over the course of their lifetimes, all sorts of gun technologies exist. Automatic weapons existed, believe it or not, or at least manually operated ones at that time. So the idea that it only applies to muskets, which is a common misconception, is just not true.
So that's, well, that right there, those are two different directions that we can go, I think, over the next couple of weeks. Is we can look at the practicalities of what legislation has been proposed. Would it make a difference? And I appreciate, Chris, the humility you bring, being willing to criticize, Democrats and some on the left. The same thing, Kyle, is clearing up some of the misconceptions. We can also look at the history of this over the years and really look at it today. And that's ultimately where I want to get to, is if we're concerned about government overreach, guns is certainly a part of it, but there's so many other ways the government can change your life that they couldn't do back in the 1800s, right? Or the late 1700s, Kyle, as you think about, once we get into currency and how it's manipulated, you can get into your information technology, your privacy, your data, all those things that are out there that didn't used to be before. And how does that relate? What protections do we have against that? So lots more to talk about. I knew we would. I love being able to get all of your different perspectives in on this and be able to try to kind of flesh out where we each are coming from and maybe where is this debate going. So thank you, Chris, Megan, Kyle, for all being on the show. Appreciate you guys being here and going through it. Next show coming up here in about 5 minutes, we're going to have Conservatism on Tap. I'm going to have 3 more guests on there. We're going to get into some other issues, a little bit more philosophy and all those things, but give us just a couple minutes to get that show set up, and we'll be right back with you. In the meantime, check us out on theberkinconservative.com, on our website, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. We're on all those. We'd love to know your thoughts on this show. If you've got questions for Megan, Chris, Kyle, let us know, and we will see you next week to pick up where we left off with this debate.